It's my pleasure for this, my second time as Dean to introduce the Hall Lecture. I'm David Ackerley, Dean of the College of Natural Resources. Wonderful to see current faculty, students, and alumni and old friends and guests. Very pleased to be here with you all this evening and looking forward to our talk by Kerry Cesareo. But before I introduce her, I want to just say a little bit about the background of the lecture series. The S.J. Hall Lecture Series is named for Sherwood J. Hall. He acquired his Bachelor's of Science in Forestry from New York State University at Syracuse in 1920 and went on to join the forestry profession as a consultant in the South for the James D. Lacey Company. In 1931, he formed Forest Managers, Inc., where he both managed forests and advised other forest land owners. One of his clients was J.C. Penney, whom he aided in sculpting barren land into a forested home for a retirement center. Hall played a major role in the development of industrial forestry in the South before moving to the West in 1948. Moving to the West in 1948, where he was one of the first to recognize the potential of the West Coast young growth timber stands. Hall and two partners acquired a 27,000-acre cutover redwood tract, establishing the Gualala Redwoods Company. The company quickly emerged as a leader in the industrial management of young growth redwood land, practicing sustained yield forestry. Upon Hall's death in 1968, his widow, Mrs. Desi Hall, moved to create the Forest Economics Foundation to advance the understanding and practice of sound economic principles among forestry students. Later that year, she established the S.J. Hall Lectureship in Industrial Forestry and the S.J. Hall Chair in Forest Economics here at UC Berkeley. Professor Matthew Potts is the current S.J. Hall Distinguished Professor, and he is here with us. Matthew, raise your hand. Matthew, thank you. Hall felt strongly that economic understanding is basic to effective forestry and to a strong nation. It's in keeping with that sentiment that we hold this annual lecture. Berkeley will be able to hold this annual event and continue to support our world-renowned programs in forest management economics in perpetuity, thanks to the generosity and foresight of Desi Hall and the beautiful thing called endowments that last forever. This afternoon, I would like to welcome and recognize members of the Hall family who have made it their tradition to participate in this annual event. Desi's daughter, Susan Hall, is here with her nephew, Kenneth Hall, and Ken's wife, Patty. Kenneth is Desi Hall's grandson. So welcome all of you, and thank you for being here again to be with us. So a couple announcements. Following the lecture, you're all invited to join us at an open reception here on the patio outside on this lovely afternoon. Following the reception, there's a private dinner, many of you are part of the private dinner, for the alumni, for the California Alumni Forester members and their guests. And so after the reception, come back in here. We'll reset this room for dinner. So dinner will be here, right here in this room. Also, there will be a Q&A session, though, after the talk, before we go on to the reception. During the Q&A session, I just ask you, I'll remind you to use the microphone. This is all being recorded, and we really want to hear the questions as well as the answers, so just be patient while we pass the microphone around. All right, last, as usual, announcement is to silence your cell phones. Our speaker this afternoon is Kerry Cesareo, Senior Vice President of Forests at World Wildlife Fund. Kerry leads a portfolio of strategic initiatives in pursuit of WWF's goal to conserve the world's most important forests. WWF is using an innovative financial model to ensure forest-protected areas are properly managed, strengthening laws to stop illegal logging, and scaling efforts to address threats to forests from agricultural expansion and infrastructure development. In 2006, Kerry successfully launched the North American program of WWF's Global Forest and Trade Network, GFTN, forging partnerships with P&G, Kimberly-Clark, Walmart, Williams-Sonoma, and others. She also managed Project Startup for the Sustainable Forest Products Global Alliance, a public-private partnership with the Home Depot and USAID, and served as operations manager for GFTN globally. She has served as co-chair of the board of the Forest Stewardship Council, US, a certifier of forestry best practices that WWF helped to found in 1994. Kerry's been involved with responsible forest management and trade for more than a decade. She had the opportunity to spend a summer working with the First Nations on Vancouver Island, British Columbia, in 2000 as they prepared for their inaugural timber harvest through a newly formed company, ESOC Forest Resources. The creation of ESOC and its commitment to FSC had helped to end decades of conflict in Clayoquot Sound among environmentalists, First Nations, and logging companies, ESOC received FSC certification in 2001 and inspired a master's project for Kerry and a career, and I know she'll be telling us more about that this evening. So please join me in welcoming Kerry Cesareo.
Well, thank you to the College of Natural Resources, Dean Ackerley, and the Hall family for this opportunity to speak with you today. While I'm not an alumna of UC Berkeley, we are members of the same family. I'm excited to talk with you today about a vision for the future. It's one that involves extensive, resilient forest landscapes that benefit biodiversity, people, and the climate, what I'd call a forest-positive future. Forest-positive, you may or may not have heard this term, but it's a term that is getting used more and more these days. But what does it mean to be forest-positive? It's an important question. Under business as usual scenario, we're projected to lose 150 million more acres of forests by 2030, and as many as 460 million acres by 2050. This summer, we saw the devastating fires in the Amazon linked to deforestation. For residents of California, I don't need to tell you about forest fires, but in the Amazon, research indicates that if we deforest the Amazon beyond 20 to 25%, it might reach an ecological tipping point and be unable to support a rainforest ecosystem. The water cycle will be disrupted, and the system will transition into something more like a grassland savanna. We're currently at about 17%. This can feel pretty depressing, especially if you've spent most of your professional career working on forest conservation. These are dire predictions. And yet, I remain hopeful, positive even, about the future of forests. And I believe we all have a role to play in creating that future. Here's what I'd like to share with you this afternoon. First, a little bit about the evolution of WWF's forest strategy, particularly the aspect of it that involves what we call market transformation. Second, I want to talk about this forest-positive approach, the science and the practice, including a link to Silicon Valley that helped us develop our thinking on this concept. And third, I want to talk about some challenges and opportunities for becoming forest-positive. And I'll share some lessons learned along the way. This has been my life's work going back to, as you've already heard, when I was 25 years old and still in graduate school, I had the opportunity to work in Clayoquot Sound on Vancouver Island in British Columbia. And I found myself in the middle of a magnificent coastal temperate rainforest stand. I was surrounded by environmentalists and First Nations elders, and a chainsaw roared to life, and a giant cedar crashed to the ground. And I was cheering, along with everyone else. So what was going on here? As Dean Ackerley said, this was the inaugural harvest of ESOC Forest Resources, a joint venture formed between a forestry company and 5 First Nations. The joint venture was an outcome of agreements forged among the forest industry, environmentalists, and First Nations to end an extremely contentious and long-running blockade of logging in Clayoquot Sound. As part of the deal, ESOC would practice ecosystem-based forestry and get certified under the still nascent Forest Stewardship Council. I was really fascinated by the elements of this tenuous peace among warring parties, but I was even more interested in ESOC's business strategy, which involved pursuing market-based solutions such as certification, but also alternative streams of revenue from things like carbon sequestration and biodiversity. But I'll never forget that first harvest. There was drumming and chanting, how weird it was to see these First Nation elders in their native dress made from cedar bark with high-vis safety vests and hard hats, because this was, after all, a active logging site. But a First Nations elder blessed the tree, thanked the Creator for the tree's life and the gift of resources, and prayed for the safety of Isaac's workers. And as the drumming and chanting faded, that chainsaw roared and that giant cedar crashed down. And a new ray of sunlight hit the forest floor, filling me with the hope and the promise of certified forestry as a way forward, not just for the people on Vancouver Island and in Clayoquot Sound, but for the world's forests. And ever since then, I've dedicated myself to making those market-based solutions work. How to keep forests standing, how to maintain the value of forests and keep them standing. So not just as a way of finding peace in the forest wars, but as a key component of forest conservation. So it was a formative experience for me. Obviously, set my path both in terms of my master's project and my career at WWF. But I also return to that story again and again because it encapsulates key themes that continue to play out in my work. I call these the three truths, and these are not earth-shattering. They will not, blow your mind, but they are that conservation and business need each other, that successful collaboration is based on trust, and that collaboration spurs innovation. I'd like to say that the Isaak story has a happy ending. I always hesitate to tell this story because the reality is that Isaak really struggled to balance sustainable forestry and economic viability. And sadly, they're no longer operating, which highlights perhaps an overarching truth. And that is that you can't just declare victory and move on. In all of this, the science keeps us honest. Did our idea work? Did our collaboration deliver? If not, why? We need to trust more deeply, face our challenges honestly, and where we have fallen short, seek to innovate again. This has been the approach of WWF. Many of you know WWF. We're the world's largest conservation organization. You may know our work on elephants, tigers, forests. But the real work of WWF has been to build partnerships, to innovate, to grapple with the challenges of trying new things, and above all, rely on science. Now, let me tell you a little bit about our strategy and how that has evolved over the years. WWF has had and continues to have a multi-pronged strategy for forest conservation. We work on protected areas, we work on forest policy, we work on getting payments for ecosystem services to work, and on market transformation. Today, I'm going to talk primarily about that work on market transformation. When I joined WWF in 2001, we were very focused on forest certification. WWF, along with many others, had helped to found the Forest Stewardship Council in response to unsustainable logging, particularly in the tropics. Forest certification is based on a simple premise, although quite difficult to implement, but a simple premise that buyers should be able to distinguish between products that come from unsustainable practices from products that are coming from well-managed forests, and then reward those good practices. Prior to FSC's founding, world leaders had failed to reach an agreement on forests at the Rio Summit in 1992. So environmental, community, business, and indigenous leaders came together and forged a new approach, a market-based solution that was FSC. It was an innovation that was based on trust, but born out of failure. WWF partnered with companies to help drive the uptake of certification, forming the Global Forest and Trade Network. Through this network, WWF worked with hundreds of companies over 2 decades to drive improved forest management on the ground using certification as a tool. We partnered with market leaders such as IKEA, Kimberly-Clark, HP, Williams-Sonoma, and many, many others. And we worked with concession holders, communities, manufacturers, and mills. And we had success. Today, nearly 500 million acres of forests around the world are certified to the FSC standard. And the FSC logo can be found on everyday products all around the world. FSC spawned other certification efforts for other commodities. The Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, the Roundtable on Responsible Soy, the Global Roundtable on Sustainable Beef, the Roundtable on Sustainable Biomaterials. Were they working? At least in terms of FSC, a recent study supported by WWF in the Peruvian Amazon found that the makeup of wildlife in FSC sites was similar to that found in forests that aren't logged at all. Another study found densities of wildlife in FSC certified forests were similar to those of protected areas. But at the same time, 12 million hectares of forest were lost in 2018, equivalent to 30 soccer fields a minute. And deforestation remains the single largest emitter of CO2 after the burning of fossil fuels. This summer, WWF reported on the first ever global assessment of forest biodiversity, which showed that forest wildlife populations have shrunk on average by more than half since 1970. Certification was never a silver bullet, and the science tells us that it's not, which brings me back to that overarching lesson. We can't just declare victory and move on. We need to assess where we have fallen short and seek to innovate again. Efforts to source responsibly were important and were having an impact, but nowhere near enough. Around the time that I was grappling with this realization, I got a call out of the blue from a former forestry school classmate who was now working at Apple. Apple wanted to talk about investing in forest projects, and not just for their own supply chains or use. In those conversations, I was still solely focused on how Apple could drive improved practices on the ground through their fiber purchasing. But I remember the moment when I came to appreciate what Apple was trying to do. Chris Bush from Apple described it for me, how they had approached the issue of renewable energy. Apple could have just bought the available renewable energy off of the grid, but that would leave less for others. So they also decided to create more supply. Apple wanted to similarly grow the pie of responsibly managed forests and do so for the long term. This conversation really resonated with me. We had just done some analysis that highlighted the enormous extent of forests at risk from deforestation and degradation. Nearly half of the world's forests are at risk. We need to reduce these threats, but we also need to increase the area of effectively protected or managed forests. In essence, grow the pie, just as Chris said Apple did in terms of renewable energy. And we need to do so at unprecedented scale and speed, particularly if we hope to meet our goal of limiting climate change to a 1.5 degree increase, below a 1.5 degree increase. This was recently brought home for me based on recent UN reports, which really elaborated what a 1.5 degree pathway means. It means halting deforestation. It also means reforesting 740 million to 1.7 billion acres of forest by 2030. To meet these goals, companies need to help us create what we're calling a forest positive future. So what does it mean to be forest positive? Being forest positive is about doing more that is good rather than just doing less that is bad. It's about giving back more to the forest than you take. It's about going from being part of the problem to maybe neutral to being part of the solution. I'm not necessarily talking about a mathematical equation. This is more of a call to action. We went on to launch a 5-year project with Apple in China that grew the area of forests under improved management by 1 million acres. Production from these forests exceeds the amount of virgin fiber Apple uses in its product packaging annually. This all started with a phone call from a long-lost grad school friend. So, stay in touch with your classmates, and maybe today at the reception, we can create some other new exciting solutions based on connecting with your fellow alumni. The China project got us thinking, how could we scale up these sort of forest-positive actions? To inform the scale of Apple's investment, they had used the approach of quantifying their forest footprint as it related to their paper-based packaging. We started asking, well, how should companies set targets for forest-positive investments? We know that what we're currently doing is not enough, but how will we know what is enough? We quickly realized that the question we needed to be asking was, how much and what quality of forests do we need to sustain life on Earth? For those of you who may be familiar with setting science-based targets for climate, you will see that the question we're asking is, what's the 1.5 degree equivalent for forests? To answer this question, World Wildlife Fund is leading the development of science-based targets for forests. Our effort on science-based targets for forests is part of a broader effort that we're feeding into through the Science-Based Targets Network, through which WWF and many others are developing targets for biodiversity, oceans, land, and water. These targets are really important for distinguishing and moving us beyond what might be perceived as just feel-good corporate philanthropy or worse, greenwashing. So how do we make sure the scale of our ambition in forest-positive actions actually gets us to where we need to go? Last year, we started work on these science-based targets for forests by doing some research related to this tipping points concept. We were inspired by the work of Tom Lovejoy and Carlos Nobre, who described the Amazon tipping point, and we wondered about tipping points for other forest systems. The results from our preliminary research were illuminating and disturbing. So, deforestation in Indonesia has led to increased greenhouse gas emissions and the decline of wildlife populations such as orangutans. But the loss of forests has also decreased soil productivity, slowing the yields of the very tree crops that have displaced the forests there. We're seeing a similar domino effect in Brazil, where deforestation has led to increased episodes of drought and flooding, which has in turn decreased soy yields. It turns out that the forests cleared in the name of economic growth are actually needed to sustain that growth. Conservation and business need each other. So how do we make that case to businesses and governments? Even here in North America, we're seeing feedback loops where wildfires and droughts triggered by climate change could push forests towards tipping points. If we transgress these tipping points, forests will lose their ability to deliver the goods and services that businesses depend on. Our research will help to figure out what regional targets are needed for forests to avert that outcome. But while we're developing these targets, we don't need to wait to take action. We don't have time to wait. And we already know the types of actions that are needed, that would be no regrets. I liken it to a phase of life I'm in right now, which is that you need to save for your kids to go to college. You might not know how much you need, but you better start saving now. Because regardless of what the target is, you want to get on that pathway. As I said, we already know what kinds of on-the-ground actions could be taken towards such targets. And these are things like engaging in and investing in conserving and restoring forests and improving their management. So we need to scale up these actions. And fortunately, these actions also help to deliver on climate, water, and other targets. And we're already working with a number of companies to do just that. So I wanted to share some examples of that. So one example is International Paper. They're supporting our effort to develop science-based targets, but they're also taking real-time action to invest in restoration in a forest region that's important for the forest sector as well as for forests. The Atlantic forests of Brazil are among the most threatened and yet most biologically diverse forests. And the restoration work that we're doing with the support of International Paper has just begun. It's in the Mogi Guachu River Basin. And we consider this a deposit in the bank against the science-based target that will be developed for the region. We can also scale our impact by aligning and focusing these forest-positive actions in particular landscapes. So essentially having multiple companies invest in a landscape. Last month, another Silicon Valley company stepped up, HP. So HP has already made significant progress in its responsible sourcing of fiber for its own branded paper, 85% of which is now FSC certified. But customers don't always use HP branded paper, and HP wanted to make an investment that would cover the total volume of paper used by customers in its printers over the next 4 years. HP is making an investment of $11 million in forest restoration, which will be in Brazil, and an increased FSC management in China. So this collaboration both builds on the investment by IP and also extends the investment by Apple in China, so accomplishing more than any one company could do alone. HP will also support WWF's work on science-based targets for forests and our work to credibly estimate the co-benefits of these forest interventions. And this will help us advocate for more companies to take more actions, more ambitious on-the-ground actions for forests. The HP initiative also kind of sets a new bar for responsible action, and they've been out talking about it. It's a great example of not just reducing harm, but of actually taking this forest-positive action. Finally, we know that forest-positive actions to sustain forests will be more successful if we can combine them with the policy-making power of governments. So the market pull of corporations combined with the power of governments can help to overcome challenges that no one entity could take on alone. These actions can be mutually reinforcing, and corporate action can actually facilitate greater public sector action. Our collaboration with Apple and China is a case in point. So why was it important for WWF to work on improved forest management in China? Well, China is the world's largest producer and consumer of paper products, but the supply within China is low, mainly because of logging bans and restrictions. And as a consequence, China imports 50% of its wood. Most of that imported wood, though, comes from countries that are experiencing high rates of illegal logging or conversion for commodity crop production or pulp plantations. These are places like Russia, Indonesia, Malaysia. So here, these forests would be more negatively impacted by continuing to be the potentially pressure from China. So it's a strategy to both encourage China to become more self-sufficient by utilizing its own forest resources, but also to help conserve those forests in its forest footprint. These also are places where many people's livelihoods depend directly on forests. By creating policies and incentives to harvest more responsibly within China, we can reduce pressure and protect these forests. So China has millions of acres of underutilized or unmanaged plantations, and with the support of Apple, we were able to work with the government to trial and institute responsible plantation management practices. This was everything from the introduction of riparian buffers to the diversification with native species to both build resilience as well as generate greater economic returns. Having achieved that million acres of forest under improved management, WWF is now working to get many of those improved management practices incorporated into Chinese regulation. And doing so would benefit an additional 40 million acres of China's forests. So this is roughly about the size of Washington state. Finally, one more example I would share is our work with Walmart and Unilever. And this is also an example of combining the power of government with the pull of major corporations. Project Gigaton is a Walmart initiative to avoid 1 billion metric tons, or a gigaton, of greenhouse gases from their global value chain by 2030. Through Project Gigaton, Walmart is encouraging its suppliers of deforestation-linked commodities like palm oil, soy, and beef to get involved in regional on-the-ground or sort of jurisdictional approaches to reducing deforestation. And last September, actually at the Global Climate Action Summit in San Francisco, Unilever, which is a major supplier of Walmart, announced that in addition to sourcing its palm oil responsibly, it was going to invest in the government of Sabah, Malaysia's effort to get all of their palm oil certified, and they're investing in the restoration of corridors for orangutan habitat. So all of these different companies and sectors are connected to forests, but we still find in our experience that when it comes to making decisions, it's still the case that forests are not usually considered unless you're maybe in the forest sector itself. And so I think for forest positive to be successful, it needs to extend beyond some of these usual suspects, which is why one of the other sectors that we've begun to engage with is the health sector. We've been working with the planetary health and exotic disease community to understand the connections between different forest actions and human health. And there's increasing evidence that land use change is a costly determinant to poor health. It's estimated that over 30% of disease outbreaks can be traced back to land use change or degradation as an underlying factor. And land use change and degradation continues to be the biggest determinant in predicting the risk of outbreaks. And yet, there's a huge disparity in the scale of funding for health versus environment, over a 12-to-1 disparity. So any science-based targets for nature should incorporate implications for human health. And we need to find ways to broaden the stakeholder base and narrative for forest conservation. So this interest in investing in forests and sort of forest-positive approaches, as I see it, is only growing. At the UN General Assembly and Climate Week last month in New York, there were over 180 commitments made by companies and governments to so-called nature-based solutions to climate change. Question for the audience. Do you know the best carbon sequestration technology we have today? No ringers here.
Growing trees.
Yes, trees. Trees are our superheroes. Forests absorb about 2 billion tons of CO2 every year. That's like eliminating the emissions of 425 million cars. The last time I gave a talk about Forest Positive, this gentleman came up to me afterwards and he gave me a bumper sticker. Like, I guess he just had them. He was carrying them around. And it said, "Trees are the answer." So trees may not be the answer to every question, but there's no answer to climate change that doesn't involve forests. Businesses and other non-state actors in the kind of climate negotiations parlance will continue to play a critical role as well. When President Trump announced that the US was pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord, thousands of companies, states, municipalities, universities stood up to say, we are still in. And at WWF, we like to say that every business is in the forest business. Businesses everywhere use paper packaging, they use buildings, they rely on rainfall, pollination, they might be affected by landslides or the availability of fresh water. They all have GHG emissions, but not every business knows about forests. So beyond these pledges, such as were made in New York, we need real action on the ground. And there's a real danger that the rush to forest projects does little to reduce real emissions and could even undermine the Paris Agreement if we're not careful. We don't have all the answers for how to make that happen. I think we actually need more expertise on forests, more forestry professionals, more forest ecologists, more forest carbon scientists. Here's one of our forest carbon scientists, Naikoa Aguilar-Muchastegui, in action. I don't know about Berkeley, but at my graduate alma mater, Yale, the relative number of graduates specializing in forests continues to decline. And yet, WWF did a modeling exercise that showed that all scenarios for halting deforestation require an expansion of managed forests to meet the future demand for wood, fiber, and biomass. It's kind of counterintuitive, but in order to halt deforestation, we actually need to expand the area of managed forests. Forest products are renewable, they can be biodegradable, they can have a lower footprint than other materials. Also, with the growing awareness and concern about plastics, it will be interesting to watch the role of fiber-based packaging and other applications. Forest management is important for climate adaptation and also for addressing the widespread and looming problem of forest degradation, the orange part of our donut. Here are just a few of the challenges we're still grappling with. How to more accurately quantify the carbon implications of different forest management practices. How do you set targets for forests and other systems that can't be reduced down to one measure, like carbon for climate? How do we think about setting targets for largely intact areas, like the Amazon, versus places that have already undergone heavy conversion, such as Indonesia? Some of our challenges come from knowing too much about the science and sort of holding that complexity in our minds. How do we think about trade-offs? Under what conditions is burning biomass the best option for the climate? Is recycled really always better than virgin? How do you incentivize corporate action to yield the maximum positive impact while you may be also envisioning a completely different system? I look to you, the broader alumni of natural resource institutions, for your collaboration and for any and all advice. And to any students in the audience, as you go about your research, if you come up with any of these, if you come up with any answers, please give me a call. If you need any thesis topics, I have a few of those. And I actually have one challenge that I could use your immediate help with. Considering the scale of forest restoration that needs to happen in order to avert climate change, in order to achieve our 1.5 degree target, and how expensive forest restoration is, we had the idea of looking at where was natural regeneration already happening, and could we take advantage of that and encourage that regrowth at a lower cost than doing restoration sort of from scratch. We spent a lot of time looking at deforestation fronts. I was really excited to look at regeneration fronts. But we need to know where forest regeneration, natural forest regeneration is happening and be able to distinguish that from other types of greening up. WWF scientists have developed an algorithm to help identify this using remote sensing globally. But now we're at the point where we need human validation to help ground truth the pixels and to provide context for why that regeneration is happening. So if this is something that any of you can help with, or if you know people who know things about forests, we would love to have them volunteer and validate our data. With FSC, with the Global Forest and Trade Network, trust was the basis of progress, and innovation was born from collaboration, such as with Apple. WWF's strategy for saving the world's forests has been a constant iteration, but at the same time, it's been a story of constants, of sticking with it. So even as we've sought to innovate, it's not as if we've abandoned certification or FSC. I'm still working to make the market-based solutions and responsible forest management that I experienced with ESOC work, and there's no pathway to forest positive without responsible forest management. So this is all to say that the solutions are complex and interdependent. There's no silver bullet. We've all been inspired by Greta. She's condemned world leaders, and rightfully so. But don't forget that there are those of us giving our all to change things. Me, my colleagues at WWF, at our partner organizations, all of you. We're doing that for Greta and also some pretty cool young people I know. Greta is actually only my third favorite climate activist. These are my kids at a climate march. As of today, we don't know what the future will look like. We know clearly what the path of inaction, what not enough, looks like. That path of inaction has not been cleared. And we must all be part of the effort to clear that path. And may we be the shoulders upon which the next generation of graduates may climb, so that they might do what we haven't been able to do yet ourselves. Thanks.
Really enjoyed your presentation. About 6 years ago, a couple of young ladies from WWF came from house door to door in my neighborhood and started talking to me and solicited monthly contributions from me, just linking to my credit card. One of them was very beautiful, so how can I resist? But anyway, I enjoyed supporting your work. But my question is, I'd learned that in the tropical rainforest, when they log the trees, clear cut them, they take the logs and they burn the slash, and much of the nutrients from the soil are locked up in the trees, in the stems and the leaves. And when that's burned, much of it goes away into the smoke. So you leave the soil very poor nutrients. So how do we regenerate forests in situations like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a effort to restore forests, and it does. I mean, the issues of soil productivity, I think, are challenging. I'm not a soil scientist myself, but I think we're grappling with that both from the standpoint of climate change as well, in terms of mitigating it. How do we think about the carbon in soils? How do we think about ensuring the productivity of soils so that we have less need to shift and clear new areas? But these are, I think, this is tough. I mean, it's much better to to avoid having to restore by being thoughtful and avoiding, what we would say is sort of like unnecessary deforestation, right? We're at a point where, we can reach, we can provide for our needs based on the already cleared land. There's a lot of analysis showing that just more efficient and better utilization of existing lands, whether they're degraded or previously cleared, is the way to go in order to avoid that problem of having to do that restoration, which is can be really difficult to get back to where we need to be. Yeah.
I'm not asking a question. I'm just going to bring it to the next person who is.
To answer specifically your question, I'll tell you what we do in Guatemala. My son and myself and my wife, we regenerate tropical rainforest that has been converted into pasture land, and we convert it back again into tropical rainforest. We do that in an industrial way. We don't use a monoculture. We use all the native species that can be utilized for lumber in the area. First thing we do is we plant a legume. We plant tropical kudzu or lablab, one of these other legumes. On that, we plant something like vanilla or cacao, chocolate plant, and amidst all that, we plant trees at 3x3 or 4x4, 5x5, depending on the species. So we get regeneration from the lowest level, which is from the legume, secondary level, the fall of leaves, from, say, the cacao plant, and the third from the trees as they grow, and they do grow rapidly in the tropics. We've been planting mahogany now for 25 years. The first time I planted mahogany, government agents came down and tried to stop me. They said, you can't plant mahogany. And I said, but the forest is full of mahogany. I said, it's generic through all of Latin America. And they said, no, it doesn't grow. There's a shoot borer that affects it. We can't do it. So, being a stubborn Norwegian Canadian, I insisted, and we found a way to do it. And also with many other native species that had never been planted before. So you can regenerate. All that land in the Amazon that's being deforested, either for soy or livestock, can be reforested with an effort, and it can be very, very productive. We produce more rosewood in 1 hectare than they do in the tropical rainforest in 100 hectares. So
This
that's
is
a
great.
solution. We work in the buffer areas of the natural rainforest. You know the case, Kerry.
Yeah.
In
This is a great example. This is great to have such an enlightened and educated office, which I'm speaking, that can bail me out on questions I can't answer. And also, I'm going to sign you up to be a volunteer for our validation exercise.
So just wondering, I mean, one of your first principles is conservation in markets, but how do you get the markets to scale? I mean, you mentioned the HP investment of $11 million. They're a $25 billion company. I mean, that's just peanuts for them. And the scale of the problem, you have to get it. How do you move it so they're really doing something aside from, honestly, it seems like greenwashing when it's that small?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is why, we are grappling with this question of, where do we need to be? I mean, I was really inspired by the experience that our colleagues working with business on climate change, the experience they had. So we had a similar a project that was modeled somewhat after GFTN called Climate Savers. We had people working for many years, working with companies to reduce their emissions, usually related to increased efficiencies, and then they got into purchasing of renewable energy and other things. And I can't remember, it was like a certain number of years after the program had been running, and they had all these companies that were signed up. And when the science started coming out about where we needed to be, and this was at the time I was looking at 2 degrees, and we did these calculations that showed that basically, from the corporate sector in terms of where we were, it was like this, and we needed to be here. And people who had dedicated their lives to this, they just like spontaneously burst into tears and were just like devastated, right? Because you think you're like doing the right thing, and I can really relate to that because having worked, really been so involved in our global forest and trade network, and feeling like, we're gonna solve this, we're gonna figure this out, and just realizing that, there are all these pieces that need to come together. And so even as complicated as it is to think about trying to articulate targets at these regional levels, we feel like we really need to know that. I mean, I would rather know how far away we are from that target than to sort of say, that's just, do we really need to set any more targets? I think people get really, weary of that, but I don't feel like there's any other way. And we've tried to be really careful, I think, in, how companies should talk about this. We're never, we're saying, no, you're not saying you're forest positive. You're not saying suddenly like, we've made this forest positive. We're saying we have to start taking these actions along the way. And hey, you know what? We may come back and move the goalposts on you. And like we've tried to say that really up front, like if you're investing in helping us develop these targets, be prepared that, when we know where we need to go. But the other part of it is, you have to have, it's not like trying to figure out the fair share of any one company is probably a road we don't want to go down, because that starts to become, just at the end of the day, like everyone needs to be doing a whole lot more, and maybe we don't get too caught up in that. But we do need that combined action, and then recognizing the limits of voluntary action, right? So in all of this, we're going to need the policy response, but these things are interrelated. So I think the example of this we are still in, WASI, sort of companies stepping up, with the announcement by President Trump, the calculation of those companies, it's significant, right? But it's not as if, you're having a regulatory approach to dealing with something. And so I think, part of our conversations with companies is that they need to use their power to influence the direction on policy. They need to actually open up that space and make it possible for elected leaders to take the hard decisions. So they have to be clear, that they're supportive, that, that's part of their leadership role, because we're going to need that piece to really, bring up the bottom and kind of do the hard stuff that no one wants to really voluntarily do. I welcome any of my colleagues who, are particularly knowledgeable on any of these topics to challenge me on that.
For the talk.
Hi.
A question building on the last response. Has WWF approached governments and the UN and the climate panel to start to build a new mechanism, a treaty, maybe outside the climate conference, to do something
That's
of the sort.
like you're like a planted ringer. Like, yeah, that's great. So yes, in fact, we are. Next year, 2020, is what's being called the super year. So you have many different processes sort of converging where we'll be looking at the progress against milestones against the Sustainable Development Goals, looking at ratcheting up the ambition under Paris, and also developing new targets under the Convention on Biological Diversity, among many other things going on. And we're using this moment in time to actually call on world leaders and everyone to basically have a new deal for nature and people. So recognizing that we need to raise the level of ambition as it relates to nature, having seen sort of the positive impact that the Paris Treaty had, but wanting to see something similar. And so that's WWF, the World Economic Forum, and many others are calling for this new deal that would help to create the space for greater ambition on nature. And similar to how the role that companies played in Paris, we're asking companies both to think about setting targets that will be developed in relation, science-based targets for nature, and to influence their basically influence governments to raise their level of ambition too. So we sort of see a push-pull there. So WWF's advocating for that, but also calling on others, including the business sector, to do so. Yeah, great question. Thanks. Yeah.
Hi. I really enjoyed your background story, and I thought that was a very inspiring story you told, even though it didn't end super awesomely. But I was wondering if WWF has any motivations or is speaking with Indigenous people about managing forests, because you mentioned increasing managers in forests.
Yeah, definitely. It's been very interesting, I think, looking at the role that certainly, Indigenous peoples manage a very important proportion of the forest estate and have done so in a thoughtful and responsible way. And, I definitely, early on in my career, was both inspired by that and see that as a really important piece going forward. We're actively engaged in many places, including, one example I'll give is in Peru, where through something called the Forest Investment Facility, we're have been helping to facilitate Indigenous communities to be able to formalize their land title so that will allow for security of title and allow for more them to continue managing responsibly without risk to tenure security. And I think one of the one opportunity I see is to really, from a systems standpoint, view that role, issues of tenure, as kind of like a systems acupuncture, where we may think about trying to solve all these problems from all these different directions, but maybe one of the ways to do so more durably and effectively is to really ensure that the stewards of those forests are able to do so. And even in the U.S., one project that it's a nascent project, but really fascinating, is we've been looking in the Southeast U.S., so in Alabama, and looking at what were the determinants of families retaining their forest ownership and managing forests sustainably rather than perhaps converting them or selling them off. And there's this issue of heirs property, so the sort of transference of property in an informal way, particularly in African American communities, that if we could find a way to kind of securitize that, address the fact that ownership has not gone through the official channels, it would allow for greater security, sort of greater wealth building, and allow those forests to stay in forests. So I really see that as a really important pathway forward, and WWF certainly views Indigenous peoples and local communities as critical and central to our conservation work, and as partnering across the globe to work in that way. Yep. Yeah.
Thank you. So this is thank you for the presentation as well. It was great. This is a twofer, if I may. The first one just picks up on your last point about land title.
Yeah.
Is that kind of collated through like blockchain or distributed ledger technology? Or could that be a way forward if that's not how you do it? Because as I understand that is an opportunity, particularly in countries where the Napoleonic Code is prevalent and it's not common law. And then the second part, second part is I've got a friend who's a Kaiser doc, and she would greatly prefer to prescribe walks in the forest than drugs and such. So I'm just wondering if there's any thought by yourself and WWF to kind of go to HMOs, et cetera, and sort of like, ramp that effort up.
Yeah, great questions. So on the first question, I don't know whether blockchain is being explored specifically on the issue of land tenure. Others in the audience may be familiar with any projects where that's happening. But we are utilizing blockchain as it relates to commodity trade, forest products trade, and things like that, including we have a project in Indonesia that's looking at how to really be able to track and trace palm oil that is we're still finding being sourced from illegal conversion of protected areas. So it's definitely, we're always looking at tools and things that would, and new technologies that could help us achieve that. On the forest health piece, this is something I'm really excited about, that we're engaging more on this. We have a project right now where we're just getting started on in the forest team, looking at this, and have some support from some health companies. We're not, my team and I aren't talking to HMOs right now, but I feel like the timing is right for those conversations to becoming more prevalent. And certainly this symposium we're hosting next week is actually part of talking to some of the scientists and the practitioners who are really deep in this, and helping WWF get a little smarter about this and think about what's the role that we should play, how could we be most effective, how do we think differently about our strategies. But I really, I think it's a really important and exciting space as we think about wellness and, and both from a just, my own personal experience standpoint, but also from the standpoint of really broadening the constituency for forest conservation, so that we start to think about things. There's a discipline that sort of tries to bring these things together. It's called interchangeably eco-health or planetary health, One Health. And it's just this idea that you can start at these different systemic levels, these interventions, and we often it's more costly and less effective to be addressing, the problems, whether it's infectious disease or other, non-communicable diseases, that if we, can sort of get the thinking changed around how being closer to natural areas and green and all of that, how that could actually deliver better health outcomes at a cheaper cost. Like, it's just, that's another, systems acupuncture there. Like, hey, maybe the way to, you have all these examples where it's like, oh, if we invest this, it has this outsized impact. And I think that's going to be true as we dig more into some of these health interventions.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. I'm going to kind of focus in and come back, and you mentioned earlier talking about looking at southern forest, but looking at California, 65% of our wood comes from out of state. We thought that carbon sequestration was going to be certainly an aid to do things. It takes somewhere between 10 and 15,000 acres to be able to afford to meet the California standards for this. If you look at non-industrial forest ownership in the state of California, it covers somewhere between 6 and 10 million acres. There are about 87,000 owners. Looking at what my organization and others people have involved, we can probably number the people that have done either forest management or fuel management or some other kind of active forest management in the neighborhood of 5,000 total. It's been that way despite the efforts of the university and other organizations. That's been that way for 2 decades or more. Yeah. If you really want to look at this, you're going to have to work from the bottom up as well as the top down. And, there are at least 2 of us here that are small industrial owners that non-industrial owners. And it's just frightening when you spend $25,000 to $30,000 before you can even start the chainsaw. And that's the current regulatory structure that we face in the state of California.
Yeah.
So I would encourage you to focus on domestic policy as well as international policy.
Yep. Yeah. Fair point. For sure.
Hi, Kerry. As you said earlier in your presentation, WWF has played a very central role in creating numerous market-based initiative certification programs in forests, fisheries, food, etc. Most of those programs have now been around for over a decade. They are voluntary. They rely upon a voluntary choice on the part of consumers to specify certified wood products, food products, etc. And over time, interest wanes. Humans have kind of a short-term perspective, and novelty is important. So my question for you is, does WWF recognize the need to somehow try to reinvigorate market interest in these programs that are no longer just the new kid on the block and have been around for over a decade?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for that question. I mean, I think maybe you keyed into maybe some of my own frustration on this, and I think this is my point. I mean, really, that's underlying my comment about you can't just declare victory and move on, because there are many organizations that were very actively involved in helping to establish FSC who have, frittered away and, left kind of, a small set of stalwarts sort of, carrying, the system continues to grow, but I think at least from, sitting in the NGO sector, this has been a big frustration, is that we've just had so many stakeholders whose own strategies really ultimately rely on there being a functioning, rely on this slice of responsible forest management that, needs to be verified, and, we think FSC is one of the best ways to do that. And yet, there hasn't been very much ongoing investment in that. So, I think one thing that, from a leadership standpoint, I think we've pushed really hard on is to sort of stay in the game on that, to continue to invest resources and say, this is a long-term, this is a long-term proposition. This is not, we set it up, now we're going to go on and move on and do other things. So certainly from WWF's standpoint, there's a constant need to even reinvigorate that within WWF. We've also looked at some of the certifications and realized that they hadn't turned out to deliver, what we had hoped they would, and we are, try to be strategic and thoughtful about that too. But where we think that it's delivering good value, we've tried to stay in the game. And, increasingly, I think I want to, engage more broadly with peers sort of in the sector, as we're gearing up to this 2020 super year, and everyone is thinking, how are we going to get to these very ambitious targets for protecting forests, and really start to show them the math, I think, that we've done on this, to say, here's where some of these areas are going to need to come from, and, we have to kind of remain engaged there. But it's a real fear. It's a fear I have, even I think with the companies who've been longtime supporters, that they get nervous and they start looking ahead to see maybe what, might be next. And I don't have the answers on how you reinvigorate on that, other than to say that you have to think about what in addition, and sort of build those things together. So I think even as we've kind of gone with this very compelling sort of, people really have responded to this forest positive term, like at the core of it, we've said, you have to first be, managing responsibly, sourcing responsibly. Like, you can't do that instead of the things that we've been saying all along you have to do. So if we can't get excitement, we are at least, building that in and saying you can't kind of move on if you want to go down the pathway with us, and we're showing you kind of what that science looks like, unless you, like the table stakes are like getting your house in order and kind of doing all those things on the responsible business side.
So I'm going to suggest, in the theme of reinvigoration, that we transition to the reception on the patio. But first, thank Kerry again for
Thank you.